a Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History. Hi, this is the second of Peter Hart Military History podcast. I'm really enjoying doing them. Last week it was the South Notts Hussars, and now this week we're going to discuss John Monash, the great Australian general. A figure. Well, it's an interesting figure. Are you looking forward to this, Gary? I'm with Gary Bain, my old friend, who's going to help us through this podcast.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it immensely because, he's the loner, the genius that won the war, isn't he?
Well, yes, that's one of many things. The man that won the war, the outsider. There's lots of stuff that there's sort of two wings of opinion. One, that he was the greatest thing since sliced bread, that he was perfect, that he invented everything that won the war, and that, the British generals are just useless and have nothing to contribute. And then there's another rather nastier side that will throw brickbats at him about his personal courage and also about some elements of his performance at both Gallipoli and the Western Front. I think we're going to go a bit of a much more middle way and try and reason our way through, talk about John Monash as he really was, not as some sort of thesis, as some sort of, trying to prove something to ourselves or to other people. We're gonna try and take a middle way and try and be sensible about it. So how should we start, Gary?
Well, okay, so tell me who he is. Where did he come from? What was his background? Was he always a military man?
Well, very few people are military men when they're born, Gary.
Very true.
But, he is German, Jewish origins. That's what he is. Much akin to yourself, minus the Russian bit, I think. He comes from, his family come from Prussia, and he was born in Australia. His family emigrated to Australia, and his name was Monash, with a C in it, and more of an emphasis on the second syllable, but it was anglicised slightly to Monash. The family, his father ran a shop. Monash was clearly a bright child and did well at school, and then went off to university. And ultimately, he becomes a civil engineer. And there you can see the man's got drive and he's got initiative, because as a civilian, he's a success. There's no doubt about that. He's a civil engineer. He works a lot in ferrous concrete, reinforced concrete, building bridges, all sorts of things. There's whole architectural studies about him, and then he develops a system of making pipes out of reinforced concrete, which I don't understand at all. But he's a successful man. He mixes in the very best of Melbourne society. If you're talking outsider, then it's only his, if you like, ethnic origins that could be portrayed as that. He is, a central figure in Melbourne Australian society. He's done well for himself. He joins the local militia. I think it's the North Melbourne Battery. Joins as a young officer, and he shows a grip of military skills right from the start. And I'm sure you're going to ask me about the correlation between his civilian life and his military skills. He's a man for detail. He's a man for laying down what he expects from his battery. He works and works at them. He plans everything. He's a really good battery commander when he rises to be battery commander. He then joins the intelligence corps, the Australian intelligence corps, and you had a brief and glorious career in the British intelligence corps, as I understand it, Gary.
Yeah, I was at one stage the only private in the intelligence corps.
How did you manage that, given that, corporal is just about the junior rank you can have in the...
That's for another day, Peter. So, when was
disciplinary problems, Gary?
So when was it? So when did he join the militia? Was it Was it clear that war was coming at this stage?
He was in it for about 30 years. I don't have the figures before me because I'm not that well organised. But he was in a long, long time. And then he was in the Australian Intelligence Corps. And finally, just before the war, he's promoted to colonel to command the 13th Brigade, an infantry brigade, in 1913. So just the last year before the war, he finally gets that command. It's interesting watching his, the book that most influenced me. There are two excellent books. One's by Geoffrey Searle, which I've ordered and haven't read. And another book is Peter Pedersen's Monash as Military Commander, which has very much informed my thinking. But Monash has showed himself as a competent peacetime military leader. He organises things like field days, exercises with real precision. He plans everything. No room for error. That sort of approach. Does this mean that he's getting it from engineering? I mean,
well, I guess attention to detail would be a fundamental requirement for a civil engineer.
It is, but it is in a lot of other fields of life. And do you not feel that this is sometimes over-exaggerated? A politician has to plan a campaign, make sure everybody's in the right place, detail. Of course, if a dam breaks, it's a bit more serious than a politician not getting elected. But, I'm not sure. What I do know is that in both his careers, he shows this attention to detail, this ability to take on new ideas, the concrete pipes, the ability to work things out and to just make sure that everything is going to work. And that will be the watchword of his career in the military and outside. Now, at the start of the war, after a brief period as chief censor, which we'll draw a veil over, because God knows what he was reading now, turn his hair blue. But he went on to... he was organising it, not reading it. He goes on to be promoted to command the 4th Brigade, the 4th Australian Infantry Brigade. Now, that's not in the original 1st Division, the 1st Australian Division, commanded by Bridges. That is in the New Zealand and Australian Division, NZ and A. That's not as catchy as Anzac, is it? No, NZ and A Division, which was commanded by a chap called Major General Alexander Godley. And here we find something that's quite interesting about Monash. When he first meets his commanders, he nearly always likes them. And he said, wonderful gentleman, he's going, he seems to admire me. That's very important to Monash, that kind of approach. And then gradually he falls out with them as he finds that they don't meet his expectations. He certainly fell out with Godley. He trains his men in Australia and then goes out to Egypt, And what he's interested in, a brigade, as you know, I'm sorry, Gary, he's 4 battalions of 1,000-ish men. And what he's very interested in is achieving a consistent level of performance across the brigade so that he has the right people in place, officers and staff within each battalion, to achieve a common syllabus, if you like, of training. Not only a common syllabus, but a common spirit, a common sense of morale. And you must remember your artillery, your military career, how important morale is.
It is, but also, what about flair? You're talking about how organised he was. How would flair feature as part of what Monash brought to the armed forces?
That's an interesting point. You mean his personality and certainly an ability to drive men without upsetting them. Because a lot of driving leaders can really be unpopular, but he always seems to be liked by his subordinates, even while he's interfering and correcting and pointing out, So he's clearly got a manner that does not put people's backs up within the units he commands, even at that early stage. He seems to have got everybody on board. Which means to me he's got a flair as a leader. I mean, because there's many different types of leadership. I'm glad you raised it. There's just do that. There's follow me. Because I'm so gorgeous. Just that kind of leader. The Lord Flashharder, to use that British comic example. And then there's the bully who will just tell you that can work. And there's different approaches, and Monash just seems to have found his own way, as most people have to, I suppose.
But there was a criticism that he didn't necessarily allow his more junior officers to actually use their initiative, and that he would direct.
He would, and that's a good point. And can we come back to that, especially when he comes to his operations, when he's a divisional commander, and corps commander, when he really starts poking? And because that's, if you could remember to come back to that, because that's a really important point, because that's one of the criticisms that can be raised against him, although I think we can refute it as well. Now, so they go off to Egypt first. And there they carry on training under the pyramids and all the rest of it, and the training programme's interesting. It really is. Monash got a grip on him, really hard driving. People were saying he was driving his men too hard at times, but he said they're going to face worse when they get into action. And again, that's pretty well right. But he maintains a discipline. The Australian Imperial Force had some problems with discipline in Egypt, as you will be aware. There's instances of brothel areas being destroyed in Cairo, that kind of thing. Most of Monash seems to have kept a grip, or perhaps, should we say, Godley, because Godley's division kept a better grip on it than Bridges' division, 1st Division, had. So then they're off to war. And I don't want to, we can't, in a podcast of 35, 40 minutes, talk too much about Gallipoli. But Gallipoli is so important to understanding Monash that we're going to have to talk about it a bit. They're not in the first landings. The 3rd Brigade, 1st Division make the first landings. They land, roughly speaking, in the right place, but they're concentrated too much in the middle. Everything goes wrong, and they end up not achieving any of the 3rd Brigade's covering force. In fact, they didn't get to the 3rd ridge, Gun Ridge as it's called. They end up on the 2nd ridge, McLaren's Hill. 2nd ridge is the easiest way to understand it. And this is where they go. Monash goes into the line. Now, so where do we go now? What do you want to ask now? I mean, where should...
Well, let's talk a little about Gallipoli, because, clearly there is the elephant in the room, an accusation that he would not go to the frontline trenches. Is there any truth in that?
Well, this is interesting because, yes, his sector was Monash Valley and the post on the high ridge that stands above you. It's very difficult to get into Monash Valley now because of the scrub, but we have both looked at this from many different angles. And you can see the post. He has from Courtney's in the sort of centre, across to Quinn's, which we've both been to and is amazing, and then on to Pope's Hill, with a gap to Pope's Hill. What a dangerous part of the line. Now, Monash's belief, he's got his men up there, his belief is that too many Australian and British senior commanders were being killed visiting frontline posts and not behaving in a cautious manner. In other words, standing there and going, what ho? That kind of approach. And this business of showing the men that they're not scared. Well, the trouble with showing the Turks that you're not scared is the Turks just shoot you. And this keeps happening to various Australian figures, And then there's the one who's shot by his own guard, the Braund is shot in a misunderstanding. He was deaf, misunderstanding with a sentry. Who goes there? No answer. Twice. That third time shot. McLaren, I think, was shot. Was sniped. His brigade major was sniped. All these people, and basically just standing there. I have to stand here because I'm I'm a senior officer. Monash has none of that. He does not visit his posts. He stays back at headquarters. Now, this is where, and there are a lot of rumours that he's scared. Now, I don't know whether he was scared or not, and I think it's invidious to look. I look at my friends and myself, and I think I'd have been scared. And Monash doesn't seem to have run round screaming. He just decided to stay at his headquarters at the end of the telephone line where he had communications with his battalions in the positions in front of him. Now, that is a logical position to me. It's sensible. It's also, though, not inspiring to the men. And one of Monash's rules was that you're meant to inspire the men. But you can't inspire the men if you never see them. And although he saw them a lot when they were out of the line, he didn't go and see them in the front line because he believed that it was a useless and stupid risk of a very important, highly trained person himself. It's a difficult topic, and a lot of people make a lot out of it. One of the things that will come to mind is that if you're a brigade commander, probably you should get out and see your men. When you're a divisional general or a corps commander, or like Haig, commander of a whole 5 armies, then there's less point in getting out, because you can't, even if you visit people, you can't see any of them. You can't see an identifiable percentage of an army. You can just see a few hundred men in the front line, and you might get killed while you're doing it. And there were a couple of times where Monash perhaps should have got forward. Telephone lines get cut, and sometimes you can't always rely on officers at the front under incredible stresses sending someone back. So this is a whole interesting area. Personally, I think too much is made of it, and it also goes along with another appalling, scurrilous rumour that's going around at the time, and that is that as a German Jew, he was some sort of traitor or spy. And this is a recurring theme. It comes back time and time after time, and it originates from within the Australian military establishment. Again, I'll probably come back to this, because the worst case of it is from a British general that I'm aware of. But it's something going on constantly. That there's just a bit of a whispering campaign against him, because he's not. This is the outsider bit, but the outsider bit is only his nationality. It's not his class or his behaviour or anything. It's his nationality and his ethnic origins, if they are ethnic, Jewish. Now, the next thing. So, I think he does well. There are a couple of. He can't be blamed for the failure of the attacks in early May, because those attacks were ludicrous. Does he cement and I quite like this bit, because does he secure Quinn's post properly? Now, this is interesting, because one of our joint favourites, and we often talk about it, is William Malone, Lieutenant Colonel William Malone, the irascible, to say the least, New Zealand commander of the Wellington Regiment, the New Zealand Wellington Regiment. Now, he takes over this post, and there's a sort of, he says, that place is in shit order. What? We're dominated. I'm going to return fire for. And he gets a grip. And he, although he's also behind, does visit the front line more. He's got a grip. He sorts out, and this Monash hadn't done. He hadn't sorted out the terraces. They're Malone's terraces. So in a way, you could say, well, does that mean Monash wasn't good? Well, the thing is, Monash was doing it in the early days, and there was a shortage of engineering stores. So it's quite interesting, which. I mean, I think if Malone had survived, he'd have also had a great career in the army. But he didn't survive. He was killed in August. So there you go. But that's interesting. So when people say how great Monash is, how great's Malone, who did an even better job of defending Quins, if you like, and was exceptionally rude about Australians, which I think both of us would agree is something that is only reasonable, from our British perspective especially, as they're normally being nasty about us, with good reason. It's nice to hear a New Zealander kicking shit out of the Australians. Always enjoyed that. So, next thing.
Well, that's interesting. So reputations can be formed from either a single action, so Malone at Quins, or over time, over campaigns, through promotions and further commands. So that's really interesting, because that leads into the attacks of the 7th, 8th of August.
6th, 7th, 8th of August. It's the night of the 6th, 7th. That's
Yeah.
And this is the great swing round. And he was meant to Monash and his 4th Brigade, who had been resting in the reserve gully, where a lot of them got dysentery. Now, when on our last tour up to Gallipoli, I think we all took great pleasure in an outbreak of what was known, Gary, as Bain's disease for a while. It's pretty uncomfortable, wasn't it, Gary? Well, you were certainly moaning,
Yeah, and I had the advantage of latrines.
Yes, and the fact is you didn't have dysentery, you had an upset tummy for a couple of days. Dysentery is very difficult. Amoebic and bacillary, sorry, I thought I'd bring it to the world's attention, but amoebic and bacillary, they're very different, aren't they? And you basically, if you don't keep your water level up, you can die of it. Now, if you haven't got much water, you're in a lot of trouble. Now, Malone's 4th Australian Brigade had been in reserve gully, which was fairly safe, but their health was deteriorated. And then they had to do this ridiculous march along the coast, all the way along the coast, past those ranges of hills that we've struggled up, down, and past, and then turn originally into the gully that leads up to Abdul Rahman Spur, and then up onto top of Hill 971. Now, that is just ludicrous. It would be hard enough coming down it.
Well, we have come down.
We have come down Abdul Rahman Spur. Very slippery, actually.
Yeah.
I remember one of our friends fell over. But the point is, at night, in the dark, and they had some New Zealand guides, but Malone had been ordered to stay in the centre of the column, and he'd been ordered to do that by Cox, Brigadier Cox of the COX, yes, of the Indian Brigade. I didn't mean Malone. I, of course, mean Monash. Monash had been told to stay at the centre of the column. It's easy to get obsessed with Malone. Drop his name into everything. But he'd been told to stay in the centre. And now the people at the front decided they'd go through something called Taylor's Gap, which is a gap, a small gap. I don't know whether you've been through that, but it's very small. It's scrubby. It's quite difficult to get through now. But at night, with a whole, best part of 2 brigades, it's a nightmare. And the Turks had been falling back from the attacks to further to the south. Were sniping at the column. The column kept stopping while they sent people up into the hills. And Monash often gets blamed for that. I think people argue both ways, but I think Monash actually helped sort things out there. Got the men through. It was a disastrous shortcut, but that wasn't his decision. He got them through, but massive delays. They come out into what's Australia Valley, and I've been lost there. Where exactly do you go? And I've gone 90 degrees wrong trying to get to Hill 60. They're trying to get to Abdul Rahman. It's dark. They don't know where they are. They get lost. And they end up in the foothills of the foothills of the foothills of Abdul Rahman, and at this point, Monash seems to slightly go to pieces, and a couple of British officers said that he's running around saying, "I thought I could command men." The source of that is Allenson, who's a Gurkha officer, a British Gurkha officer, if you know what I mean. How accurate that is, I don't know. The man was prone to exaggeration. I think the story's over-exaggerated, but there are a few sources that show that he was rattled. I'd be bloody rattled as well. A night march, the Turks appearing in strength in front of you at the end. You don't know where you're going. They're actually not where they think they are at all. And the whole thing is a flaming disaster. It is a disaster. And it doesn't end well. And Monash's reputation took a denting from this. He had failed. Later on, there's 2 attacks, 21st and back end of the month of August, 21st of August, back end of August. There's 2 attacks launched on Hill 60. He didn't order them. He was ordered to carry them out. They were disasters in many ways. Lots more casualties. People burnt to death in scrub fires. It was awful. Is it his fault? I don't think so. Not at all. Overall, he performed reasonably well in terrible circumstances at Gallipoli. What more can you say? Not many people improve their reputation at Gallipoli. I think he'd shown that as a civilian, remember, he could command the brigade, and he had shown an ability to organise the front he was in command of. And I think he did well. Less well in the offensive, but who no one did well in that.
Okay, at this point, I'd like to move on from Gallipoli and his subsequent arrival on the Western Front.
Well, yeah, he comes back with his same brigade. It comes to the Western Front in June 1916. But then he's promoted almost immediately. He gets a little bit of experience, organised a couple of raids, well planned, and then he goes to command the 3rd Australian Division. Now, here he's got a spot of luck because he's given a whole 4 or 5 months in England from July to December 1916 to train up the 3rd Australian Division. Now, this is his big moment for this is where, as you'd imagine, this is where his skills fit the pattern, don't they? What's he good at? Detail, organisation, training. And he really does a brilliant job. He inculcates everybody with a common sort of tactical methodology. They're all going to work in the same way. He wants the same tactics. He wants the same good morale spread across. He takes the fantastic care over the selection of key officers and members of his staff. Is it new? Do you know what? To me, it just sounds like most military training. The thing about Monash, though, is he seems to have just done it better. It's not original. It's just time-honoured in some ways things done very, very well.
So would you suggest then that he wasn't actually doing anything differently?
No, I don't. Lots of generals have taken control of a division and started doing this. He just did it very well. And for that, he is to be congratulated, because whilst a lot of people have done it very well, a lot more have done it badly. He deserves credit for the way he trained his division.
During that period, you've got the battles of the Somme going on the Western Front, and yet it would appear you've got a valuable resource back in England. Was it because they were starting to recognise his abilities and the Australian military establishment were trying to promote those abilities?
No, not at all. No, it's just that the way they were reforming the Anzac Corps and the rest of the divisions was a new division, and it had to be trained back in England. He was just very lucky that he wasn't involved in the Somme or Fromelles, which was another battle on the West Front 16, both of which were utterly disastrous and very painful. He could learn the lessons that were being learnt on the Western Front and then apply it to his training, and he did that. He was a very, very good general.
So is this where he develops the methodology which many people attribute to him as being unique and war-winning that led to the victories at Hamel and Amiens?
Absolutely not. He is part of the British Army. It is the British Army that develops the fighting methods that he would apply then. The British Army under Haig, but not done by Haig in personal sense, but as a sort of overseeing eminence grise, if you like, they're engaged in a process of best practice. That's what's going on. Every action is analysed, every new weapon is analysed, they're fitted into the overall pattern, and then a series of pamphlets, the SS pamphlets, the stationary service pamphlets, are issued and widely disseminated and then backed up by training schools. He is not alone, but he is doing a good job of it back in England. When he gets to the Western Front, he's involved in three big battles as a divisional commander. And it's interesting what happens. The first one is Messines in June 1917. And he is on the right of the Australian line as they attack towards the Messines Ridge. He plans it in awe-inspiring detail. Everything. And people often say that the great thing about Monash is that when you'd taken the line, he made sure you knew you had to defend it, made sure you knew you had to get communications back, made sure you knew the barrages were going to crash down in front of you so you didn't go too far, made sure that arrangements were in hand to get hot food brought to the troops in the front line. And you, Gary, who's I can see at a glance enjoys a good meal, you would very much appreciate that. And do you know, tired soldiers who've just fought a battle, what better than to have a hot meal brought forward to them? Beer, but yes, that's not going to happen. But and he did all this, and this is where people start saying, isn't he poking into small, deciding things that should be left by brigadiers? Yeah. When he was a brigadier, he wanted to control things. Now he's a divisional general. He seems to be rather bossing them about. This is interesting, and for this I do require to call on my friend Peter Pedersen, who was a colonel, a very distinguished colonel in my view, and another Australian historian, Chris Roberts. He was a brigadier, even more distinguished. And these people have practical military experience, and what they tend to think is that Monash overstepped the bounds, but he was really bright and really good. And sometimes he thought of things that his brigadiers didn't think of. And because they didn't think of them, he told them. And sometimes he jumped the gun and told them before they'd not thought of it. Now, is that a crime? My answer is, do his brigadiers perform well for him? Yes, they do. So clearly they put up with it. Does his division perform well at Messines? Yes, it does. They achieve their objectives. There's trouble. There always is trouble in it. Because people forget it's not just you planning something. There's the other buggers, the Germans, on the other side. They have their clever generals, their plans. They have their... It's not just one side, it's two-sided. One general is facing another general. One army is facing another army. It's not just that simple, as people like to think. His next battle is Third Ypres. This is less dramatic. Third Ypres, he fights a battle of Broodsinder, advancing the early stages of the ridge. Successful. But then, and this is the one I'm quite interested in, he does badly in the later October battles of Passchendaele, Now, why does he do badly there? I'll tell you why, because the ground is in an impossible state. Now, there's some things you can't overcome. You can't overcome topography. It's an awful place to fight. The ground conditions are dreadful. You just can't overcome it just because you want to by wish fulfillment. You can plan all you bloody like. But actually, do you know, sometimes probably a bit of a closer look to see what's really happening at the front? Monash didn't do that. Aerial photos, that's all. Never visits the front. Doesn't see the problems. Would it have gone better if he'd seen the problems in front of him in those two battles? I don't know, because he didn't. I don't suppose anyone, you can make a value judgment. It might have gone a bit better, it might not. He might have made a dreadful mistake and made it worse. So, who knows? But it is an occasion where a bit of a closer look might have helped. The next thing, though, is that he's been noticed. And who do you think noticed him? Is it a member of the Australian military hierarchy that have noticed his excellent performances? Who would it be that noticed him that really matters? Douglas Haig. And Douglas Haig was very, very impressed by Monash. He was impressed by his intellect. He was impressed by his ability to express himself, something we're not always good at, I know. Sorry, listeners, sometimes we flummox a bit, but he was impressed by the way he could express himself, briefings. If he was asked a question, he could answer it. Haig was very much a supporter of Monash. Now, on the contrary, the Australian military establishment was not so keen. And I'm afraid that the blessed Bain, the official history writer, was part of this. He was an admirer of Monash, but there's just he wasn't one of us. And when you say he wasn't one of us, he was German-Jewish, is I think what they're meaning. This may be a calumny, but there's some stuff expressed that is not right. They're still talking about him not going to the front, that kind of thing. And it's really more Haig that gets him promoted. And he does get promoted, and he gets promoted on the 1st of June to be a Lieutenant General and command of a corps, which is 2 divisions. I'd point out that an army is 2 or 3 corps, and that Haig had 5 armies. This is how far below Haig Monash is. Now, he then becomes a legend. He uses the all-arms battle that the British Army has developed, not him. He loses that thing, and he uses it to firstly a trial, and that's the Battle of Hamel on the 4th of July, 1918. And this is the most amazing, sort of all everything works. But it's tanks, it's aircraft, it's the whole thing. Machine guns. He was a great believer in machine guns. Other thing and this he is. I think an originator although not the originator, the use of smoke shells, so the Germans can't see what's happening. He uses a lot, and the Battle of Hamel, it's a small battle, is a great success. He's then given much of the planning responsibility for Rawlinson's 4th Army attack on the 8th of August. The
Black Day for the German Army.
Yes, said by Ludendorff, no less. Who's also covering his tracks a little bit. But now this, what is he doing here? Well, he's using the same methods as at Hamel. He's using it on a grand scale. Do you know, his planning processes are amazing. Him and Curry, who's commanding another major force, the Canadian Corps, they work together well. The British Third Corps don't go quite as well, but then they're given the worst area to attack it. It's everything. It's the biggest tank attack of the war. It's the aircraft, the use of aircraft, the use of gas, the use of machine guns, the use of supply tanks, the use of tanks generally, the use of artillery, the creeping barrages, the standing barrages, every bloody sort of barrage you can name. It's all there. And it is a brilliantly organised battle. And Monash is at the heart of it. To me, it's his piece de resistance. He's just done a brilliant job. Is he the originator of it? No. Is he a superb practitioner of it? Yes. That's what he's done. He's done brilliantly. He is a general right at the top of his game. And how you can not admire him for his performance in the 8th of August, or indeed Hamel, I don't know. He is wonderful. He's done a great job, and that's that.
You mentioned Curry, and often Monash and Curry are mentioned in the same breath, as leading the charge to the winning of the war.
Arthur Curry, commander of the Canadian Corps, another civilian general, I think. Yes, but very competent. Slightly dodgy financial practices in his early life, but I believe he overcame them. A wonderful general, just like Monash. I prefer to think of the British had wonderful generals as well. You just Tudor, the artillery general, Haig, the supreme educated soldier and staff officer, because that's what he was. We had our own brilliant generals. I'm quite a fan of Horn. These people are good generals. And what I want to say to you is, people get overexcited. The Australian Corps is the biggest corps in the British Army. They had attached forces. They also had 4 battalions to the Brigade still. The British had been cut to 3. It had been deliberately kept out of some of the worst of the defensive fighting in early 1918. The Canadian Corps similarly had been preserved as a strike force. But what I want to say is, don't get into bloody nationalistic arguments about it. They are brilliant, both of them. Who's better? Who cares? Grow up. Are the best of the British and French divisions as good as them? Yes. They're a benchmark, and other formations are as good as them. Why be childish? Can I think of anyone better than the Australians and Canadians? Not really. Can I think of units from other French or British who are as good? Yes, I can. Not all of them.
Name that too.
Well, the point is, I'm not going to name, because I'm just saying it doesn't matter. What I will say is that later on, the 46th Division, which is a very mediocre British division, does brilliantly. And it does brilliantly because of the methodology that has been established, and also the state of the German army. It's not the 1916 German army. It's suffering. Now, so that's, you might ask, in your lovely manner, how does he do for the rest of the war? And you might think I'm going to say he did equally brilliantly. Well, he doesn't. He's influential in persuading Haig not to keep attacking in that area, and I think that's important. Him and Curry, and the British generals, Rawlinson as well. That's Rawlinson. General Rawlinson is Monash's commander of 4th Army, but after that, he sort of, I think, fatigue sets in, because it's quite interesting. He starts to make mistakes, and he also. There's the amazing achievement in the capture of Mont Saint-Quentin and Peronne. I'm not sure it's got that much to do with Monash, though. Funnily enough, because he doesn't go forward, he's not really on top of the situation. It's his subordinate, his brigadiers and his divisional commanders who get a grip on the situation, and the supreme fighting abilities in that action of the Australian infantry that deliver the victory. But more seriously for me is... the battle of the 29th, the attack on the Hindenburg line on the 29th of September. Now, we've been there. We've been to the famous bridge. Well, he was operating to the north of that, in the bit where the canal isn't there, where there's a tunnel. His plans were foolhardy. He was using the Americans from a line they hadn't reached, which meant all the plans were dodgy. The Americans were given a near impossible task. There's 2 American divisions attached to the Anzac Corps. And he treats them appallingly. He gives them an unrealistic plan. And when they fail, he sends the Australians in to rescue the situation, or try and rescue the situation, and then blames the American troops. It's not their fault. It's his plans were unrealistic and not thought through, not like him at all. Was he tired? Or rather exhausted. It was more like... And the other thing is, he then rather unpleasantly blames the Americans, Then later on, he doesn't understand. He makes more mistakes in the approach to I can't pronounce it, Beaurevoir line, and then the capture of Montbrehon. But do you know what? this isn't his great style, but these are not serious mistakes for the most part, except for the Americans. What these are a man and his corps, the Australian corps, come to the end of their tether. The battalions are down to 250 men. Brigades are down to 1,000. There's no reserves. The Australians didn't have conscription. They've got no stream of reserves coming in. It's almost impossible to... they start to have to break up battalions. In a cheery Australian manner, they start to... Well, mutiny is bad. Strike. When they're out of the line, but they start to object to breaking up. The whole thing is going wrong. He was suffering from personal exhaustion, and his men had had enough. But what I would say about this period is how ruthless Monash is. His willingness to drive his men on. In the capture of Mont Saint Quentin, he actually says to one of his, I think it's his brigadiers, casualties don't matter. Not something any soldier ever likes to hear. I think that's that's basically the end of the war for him. He then takes a big role in sending the troops back. He's part of the organisation of the demobilisation and return the troops. What else can we say about Monash?
Well, I'd like to perhaps finish with a little bit of controversy, if I may. There is a suggestion, shall we say, at the moment, that he's promoted posthumously. What's your view?
Well, it's just ridiculous. You can't change history. It's like posthumous. I always connect it in my mind with the thing of a posthumous VC for Simpson, Kirkpatrick, several names. The Gallipoli hero from traditional Australian hero born in England. But the point about it is, if you push people for things that they didn't get at the time, you can attract a lot of brickbats coming back the other way, because you attract attention and people say, well, no, they didn't think that at the time. He wasn't a general. He was later on promoted about 1929 to be a general. He was a lieutenant general. That's nowhere near a field marshal. Did he deserve praise? Did he deserve everything else? The honours that came to him the rest of life. He did. But, I want to say he never had the opportunity to be a great captain. He could never be a Napoleon, a Wellington or anything like that, because he never, ever had an independent command. An independent army command. He was commanded by Rawlinson. And Rawlinson, although Monash didn't know it, I mean, some of the correspondence quoted in Pedersen's book is heartrending. Saying that he was talking about another Jewish chap, and he's saying we know how to deal with these slippery Jewish types, that kind of thing. It's just awful. We had that with Monash, and we knew how to deal with him. Awful stuff. And Monash had to put up, whether he knew it or not, he was getting the backlash of various things. He never had the chance, and he never would have had the chance unless the war went on several times. He was a corps commander in an army, of which there were 2 or 3 corps, and then there was 5 armies. He was a way off field marshal level as Douglas Haig was. The thing is, was he perfect? And the answer to this is no. But then, not Gary, neither are you. I know. Yes, I know. Yes, gasp indeed. He was all too willing to blame other people for his faults. When he made a mistake, he would look to blame it on someone else. Well, that I would say is human nature. I've been known to do that myself. He tended to exaggerate his own influence on events. He was generally boastful, and he looked to maximise the honours and awards he got. Well, again, this is fairly standard stuff for the human being. And do you know what? What general isn't like that? I mean, look at Montgomery, the blessed Montgomery in the Second World War. You couldn't get more egotistical. So these are ordinary things. I think Monash, though he didn't get independent command, was a great divisional and corps commander. And he wasn't bad at brigade level. He never got a chance to command an army, and that's how it is. I think that we don't have to exaggerate his achievements. He was probably the greatest general Australia ever produced. And I don't mean to denigrate anyone else Australian by saying, I think he was fantastic. He was a great general, and I think his Australian corps, the achievements of that are unbelievable. They will stand the test of time. People will look to them and say, That's how a really good formation of troops would behave under the extreme stress. They couldn't do any better. The benchmark, as I said. So I hope you'll think about Monash. I hope everyone listening to this thinks about what they think about Monash. About do they go with a hyperbole, or do they go with the facts and more reasoned approach?
Thank you very much, Peter.